Hey everyone, welcome to Truly Fertility. My name is Haley, and last week I shared how to predict your period even if you have irregular cycles. This video today is pretty much going to be an expansion on last week's video. I talked about how there are two phases of a woman's menstrual cycle. So she's got the follicular phase and the luteal phase. Today we're going to be talking about why you have these two phases, what causes these two phases, and those are going to be hormones. Hormones are basically messengers that tell your body what to do and when to do it. So there are four main reproductive hormones that we're going to be looking at today, and they all have a very, very important play within your whole reproductive system, within your whole menstrual cycle. And so if these hormones are not speaking to each other correctly, then that would be a sign of a hormonal imbalance. So we are going to be looking at the four main reproductive hormones within your body as a woman. I'm going to teach you a little bit about them, where they come from, what they're supposed to do. So if you want to learn more, keep watching this video. But before we really understand that, we have to understand what's going on within your ovary. So ovaries, most women have two of them. They're about the size of like an almond. And within the ovary are a bunch of follicles, and these follicles contain the eggs that are going to be released from the ovary every cycle, or should be released from the ovary every cycle. So the hormones that are at play within your cycle tell your ovary, tell the follicles. It kind of makes that whole system work, right, in a rhythmic way. The cycle, right, every cycle, same thing should be happening over and over and over again. So how I'm going to kind of divvy this out is we're just going to start from the very beginning of your cycle, talk about what hormone has its play first, and then just go on throughout the menstrual cycle to the very end. So day one of your menstrual cycle is day one of your period. The last day of that cycle is the last day or the day before your next period. So from day one of your period to day before your next period is one menstrual cycle. So we're going to be looking at what hormones are at play within that menstrual cycle. Let's do it. So the first one we're going to talk about is FSH, which is follicle stimulating hormone. FSH is a hormone that actually starts in your brain. So the pituitary gland in your brain, that's what produces FSH at the very beginning of your cycle. So day one of your period, FSH will start to rise, and that is your brain sending messages to your reproductive system to start telling it to, here we go, pick a follicle, let's start making it mature so that we can ovulate the cycle. So this hormone does exactly what it says it does. It stimulates the follicle. It's follicle stimulating hormone. So like I said, within your ovaries, you have a bunch of follicles. So this hormone is telling your follicles to start maturing, basically. And through this time of your cycle, one is going to become dominant, and that's the one that is going to mature all the way to ovulation. Side note, ovulation, super important. That's when the egg is released from your ovary. That is the main event of your cycle. It should be happening every cycle. So that's FSH. Once FSH is starting to rise, the second hormone starts to rise a bit after it, and that's estrogen. So estrogen is a hormone that comes from your actual ovary. It actually comes from the follicle that has been picked to start growing that cycle. One of the main things that estrogen does is it produces cervical mucus within your cervix. So your cervix there are little crypts within your cervix, and these crypts of your cervix are creating cervical mucus in response to that estrogen rise. So when estrogen rises, you'll start to see more discharge. You'll start to see more of that cervical mucus, which is perfectly healthy, totally normal, should be happening. Your body during this estrogen high time is preparing to be fertile. It's preparing to receive sperm. This estrogen type mucus is actually going to be very receptive to sperm cells. So microscopically, if you were looking very, very closely at an estrogen type of mucus, so basically cervical mucus that's being produced by your body when estrogen is really high, if you look at it microscopically, it actually has little channels that the sperm can travel through. Sperm can actually live within this type of cervical mucus for up to 5 days. So if you think about it, a woman could have intercourse on a Monday, and that sperm from her intercourse on Monday could actually still be living within her body on Thursday. Isn't that just insane? So this cervical mucus within her body is actually life-giving to sperm. So sperm cells can stay within a woman's body for up to 5 days. It can still live. Without cervical mucus, sperm die within hours. So if you think about it, hours versus 5 days, cervical mucus gives life to that sperm cell. So the woman's body is pretty much getting ready, or it is fertile. It's getting ready to receive the potential for life. Another really cool thing that estrogen type cervical mucus will do is it actually filters out abnormal sperm. So there's already like this natural selection thing that's going on within the woman's body in relation to the man's body in intercourse, and gosh, it's just so cool. Another part that estrogen plays is that it helps regrow the endometrium. What does that mean? The endometrium is the uterine lining. So within your uterus, there's a lining within it, and that is simply called the endometrium. And the endometrium is actually what is shed at menstruation. So that the lining of the uterus is your period. That's what's coming out during your menses. So every cycle, this endometrium or this uterine lining has to regrow. So estrogen plays a huge part in that. Estrogen is the hormone that helps it begin to regrow. Lastly, as estrogen starts to grow, more in the beginning of a woman's cycle, it'll usually peak the day right before ovulation occurs. So we started with day 1 of a woman's cycle. That was follicle stimulating hormone. Does exactly what it says it does, stimulates the follicle, picks one that's dominant so that can eventually be where the egg is released from in ovulation. We started from there, then estrogen started to rise and rise and rise, creates that really life-giving cervical mucus. Estrogen will peak, usually the day right before ovulation, and now we're here. Now we're at the main event. We are at ovulation. The third hormone is luteinizing hormone, or LH. Luteinizing hormone also comes from that pituitary gland, the same place in a woman's brain that FSH comes from. So FSH and LH both come from the brain. So this hormone is usually pretty low, pretty much throughout the whole cycle except for one time. And this is right before ovulation. LH will spike. It's actually called the LH surge. And LH spikes, and this is the hormone that says, okay, body, it's time to ovulate. So that LH surge, LH will rise within a woman's body, and that usually is what triggers ovulation. So when LH is high, ovulation usually occurs within 12 to 24 hours after that. LH will surge really high for a very short amount of time, and then it just goes right back down and stays pretty low throughout the rest of the cycle. So the 3 hormones that we've talked about so far, FSH, which is follicle stimulating hormone, estrogen, and luteinizing hormone, or LH, these 3 hormones all play a part within that follicular phase. So again, the last video I posted, I talked about how there are 2 phases of a woman's cycle. So there's follicular phase, luteal phase. These 3 hormones that we've talked about all play a part within the follicular phase. In the luteal phase, this is where progesterone comes in, which is the 4th hormone and the last hormone that we're going to talk about today. Progesterone also comes from the ovary, and it also comes from the follicle. However, after ovulation, that follicle is now ruptured because that's where the egg left, right? And so that ruptured follicle, what happens to it? Well, here's what happens. So it starts to become something called the corpus luteum, which is just a fancy Latin word for yellow body. It literally becomes yellow, and this is what starts to produce progesterone. Progesterone is the dominant hormone within this phase of a woman's cycle. So progesterone does 4 main things, and 4 main very important things to a woman's cycle after she's ovulated. So she ovulates, progesterone rises, 4 things happen. First one, progesterone prevents ovulation from happening again. So every woman will ovulate pretty much just one time within her cycle. Very rarely she will ovulate twice, and that's where twins come from. But that second ovulation will only ever occur within 24 hours of the first ovulation. So progesterone, once that hormone starts to rise after ovulation, that hormone nixes ovulation from happening again, that cycle, until the next cycle occurs, and then it all starts over again. The second thing that progesterone does is that it elevates a woman's body temperature. Okay, let's talk about that for a second. I don't know if you ever raised chicks as a kid, and you had the Home Depot bucket and you put a bunch of eggs in there and then you put the heat lamp over. Yeah, so that heat lamp is super important. Why? Because in order for life to grow and to mature and to be nurtured, it needs heat. So the same thing happens in a woman's body. Every single cycle, after ovulation, a woman's body is preparing for life within her. It is preparing to nurture and to protect a newly conceived life within her. Mind-blowing. So every cycle, whether a woman is pregnant or not, her body starts to prepare for a possible pregnancy. So every cycle, a woman's body acts as if there is a possible newly conceived life within her. So every woman's cycle, after ovulation, progesterone rises, and this hormone causes her body temperature to rise, because just in case she did get pregnant that cycle, there is a newly conceived life in her that needs to be nurtured and needs to be protected, and that's what that heat does. So that heat within a woman's body will continue to allow that newly conceived life to grow, to be nurtured. That's why a woman can take her temperature every morning and know when she is ovulated, because if she's taking her temperature every single morning, which is her waking temperature, that's the base temperature within her body throughout the day, it's a very consistent and accurate temperature. If she's taking her temperature every day and she starts to see her temperature rise, then she can confirm that she has ovulated, because that's the progesterone effect in her body, is that her body temperature is going to rise. Just so cool. The third super important thing that progesterone does is that it dries all of that cervical mucus up. So in the estrogen high phase of a woman's cycle, while she was more fertile, that cervical mucus is going to be a flowing. In the progesterone high part of her cycle, that luteal phase or post-ovulation, her mucus is going to dry right up, because her body is now going to be infertile, completely infertile for the rest of that cycle. So her body isn't going to be receptive to sperm cells anymore. So her body pretty much just dries up all of that cervical mucus, and it makes the cervical mucus plug. Yeah, within her cervix. And it actually prevents sperm from traveling through, because it doesn't have those channels anymore. It actually is just like one big block of mucus, creating that mucus plug within her cervix. Another really cool thing though that mucus plug does is that it prevents any bacteria from entering the woman's body either. So it also plays just a part in her overall health too. The last thing, that fourth thing that progesterone does, is that it enriches the uterine lining. So we talked about how estrogen will regrow or start to regrow that uterine lining. Progesterone picks up after it, and it really enriches it. And again, like I said, every single cycle, a woman's body doesn't know whether or not it's pregnant yet. And so it is preparing for pregnancy every cycle with progesterone. So progesterone will enrich that uterine lining or the endometrium, so that if there was a newly conceived life within her, that new life will have a place to kind of nuzzle in and receive more of its nutrients from. Progesterone makes the uterus a life-giving environment for that newly conceived life. In the last video, I talked about how the luteal phase is very constant, so it's usually about 2 weeks for every woman. Let's say in this scenario that the woman we're talking about with all of these hormones interplaying within her this cycle, let's say she's not pregnant. Let's say this cycle she did not get pregnant. Well, what happens? So after about 2 weeks, remember that luteal phase is very constant. That's when her body will start to recognize, okay, not pregnant, don't need this enriched uterine lining, don't need a high temperature, don't need all of these things that her body has been revving up for in case there is newly conceived life within her. Don't need any of those anymore. So estrogen and progesterone being the dominant one still within that luteal phase, both of those hormones will come crashing down, and that's what starts this whole thing over again. So estrogen and progesterone crash down, and that's what causes a woman's body to start her period, because that enriched uterine lining that estrogen played a part of, and then progesterone really nourished it even more, so that if there was a baby, that baby would need that uterine lining. Well, she's not pregnant, so there's no baby, so then what happens? Comes crashing down. That uterine lining will slough off, and that will be her next period. At that point, FSH, or follicle stimulating hormone, is released again from the pituitary gland, and the whole thing starts all over again. Okay, so there you have it. Those are the 4 main reproductive hormones within every woman's body. Again, remember we have FSH, estrogen, LH, and progesterone. They each play an incredibly important role within the woman's reproductive cycle. They take turns, they talk to each other. Each one is very, very necessary. If you're interested in learning how to chart your cycle, so that you can actually see these hormones playing a part within your body. Because again, these hormones tell your body what to do. So the signs that, that cervical mucus that we talked about today, you can start actually observing that and seeing estrogen play a role in your body, progesterone playing a role in your body. It's so cool that by charting, you can actually see these hormones move within your body. If you want to learn more about how to get started doing that, I put links in the description below for all these different types of charting methods. There's no right one, there's no wrong one. It's just whatever you choose to do. And if you have any questions about that, please let me know. I would be happy to guide you in choosing which method that might be right for you. And ultimately, I hope this video helped you to better know your cycle, know your body, so that you can truly live your fertility.